Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Pikarski from the class of 2021, majoring in political science. I am also pleased to be the Johnson Wales Political Science Policy Lab coordinator. Following our recent national election, we are excited to bring this program to you titled Deconstructing Election 2020. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few Zoom tips. Please turn off all applications other than Zoom to avoid any service disruptions or distractions. To hide any non-video participants indicated by a black box with a name, hover over the box, click on the three dots in the right corner, then click on Hide Non-Video Participants. Please keep yourself muted and video off during the presentation. Following the presentation, we welcome questions from the audience. Please indicate if you wish to ask a question via the hand raise feature, and Dean Fine will call upon you. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. It is now my pleasure to introduce from the John Hazen White College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Michael Fine.
Thank you, Tyler, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dean Michael Fine, and on behalf of Johnson & Wales University and the College of Arts and Sciences, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Political Science Program's Policy Lab. Today's event features 4 invited guests: Amanda Grandjean, Ohio's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Director of Elections; Jonathan Brader, Director of Michigan Bureau of Elections; Robert Blair, Director of the Institute for Democratic Erosion and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs at Brown University; and John Curiel, Research Scientist at MIT's Election Data and Science Lab. Our 4 esteemed guests are here today to help us deconstruct the 2020 election and share their views on its significance. This election is particularly distinct for what it reveals about the further polarization of our country, as well as its unprecedentedly contested nature. At the macro level, this election serves as a measure of the well-being of our democracy. As a component of this, it highlights the erosion of public faith in democratic institutions at a time when a global pandemic has profoundly affected the rhythms and practices of everyday life. Adaptations to the pandemic to carry out the vital affairs of state, such as holding a presidential election, has meant expanding mail-in balloting and early voting, a trend common in other democracies but rare in the United States. And this again showcases the extraordinary nature of the election, including the less well-reported aspect of what functioned smoothly, effectively, and accurately during this election. Examining what the data tells us, from record voter turnout to how states and districts turned red or blue, or how the supposed blue wall appeared to fizzle out, will also be part of our task today. Regular attendees of the Policy Lab know that this is a virtual space for political science students and students across the university to interact up close with makers and practitioners of public policy on a regular basis. This event nicely embodies JWU's commitment to the applied liberal arts, a learning by doing approach that allows students to engage directly with practitioners in their fields and industries of study. Past events have examined the role of public policy professionals in ensuring the public good, exploring the impact of lobbying on policymaking, and highlighting how elections are administered at the statewide level. Today's culminating event provides a tremendous opportunity to look back on an election that in many ways is still unfolding and to cap off a tremendous inaugural year of JWU's Policy Lab. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to thank Professor DeJesus for his innovative efforts to support students in their real-time exploration of politics. I'd like to thank Tyler and his peers in the Political Science program for joining in this initiative. Thank you to the events staff for providing the all-important behind-the-scenes work to ensure that things run smoothly. A special thank you to our guests, of course, for sharing your rich experiences amidst an unprecedented election season. And lastly, thank you to our students for the spirit in which you've undertaken this important work of inquiry, discovery, and civic engagement. As I have the great pleasure of moderating today's event, at this point, I will call on each of our guests to turn on their cameras and microphones and say a few brief words of introduction. If we could begin with Deputy Assistant Grandjean from the state of Ohio.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you virtually from the great state of Ohio. Finished up a wonderful election here in Ohio. I'm happy to be here and talk about all of the great statistics and all the preparation we did to prepare for such an unprecedented election. But thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mandy. And next, Director Brader from the state of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate. My name is Jonathan Brader. I direct the Michigan Bureau of Elections. The Bureau of Elections supports the Michigan Secretary of State in her capacity as the state's chief election officer. And in doing that, we help coordinate the work of our more than 16,000 city, township, and county clerks that administer elections in Michigan, and what is one of the most decentralized systems in the country. Our local officials did a tremendous job running the election, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you about how they were able to manage that and how we were able to support them. Like every other state in the country, Michigan did an excellent job allowing our democracy to continue to function in the midst of the pandemic, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. And next, Dr. Blair from Brown University and the Institute for Democratic Erosion.
Hey, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name again is Rob Blair. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And I'm also the coordinator of the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a network of over 50 universities in the US, UK, Ireland, Israel, Turkey, Romania, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. I hope I haven't left any countries out there. And as a consortium, our goal is to combine teaching and research and civic and policy engagement to help our students and faculty better understand threats to democracy in the US and also abroad, and better address those threats through our work as students and educators and citizens. So I'm really delighted to be with you here today.
Thanks, Rob. And lastly, Dr. Curiel from MIT and the Elections Data and Science Lab.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be back. So for those of you who don't know, I'm John Curiel, and I'm with the MIT Election Data Science Lab, which has been conducting analyses to aid election administrators and other stakeholders in, running an election amidst this pandemic, in combination with our previous work in collecting precinct data to aid in a variety of research fields such as redistricting, election audits, and all of that. And I am happy today to talk about my work from Cambridge about how the 2020 election went, and answer a variety of topics, or answer a variety of questions about that. And I look forward to all your questions.
Well, thanks everybody. And to our students in the audience, the way this will unfold is we'll have, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'll be posing some questions to our panelists. And then around 2:50, we'll switch over to take questions from the student population. And I'll be happy to direct those towards our panelists. I should note from all of your introductions, and I'm sure our students picked up on this as well, that each of you is coming to this conversation from a different vantage point. Some of you are state officials charged with overseeing the electoral process. Others are academic analysts and observers. And I'm sure that each of your perspectives will offer us something different and unique and important to this conversation for our students to learn from today. One of the words we keep hearing about in the 2020 election is it's unprecedented. And I think that's gotten a considerable amount of use, maybe some overuse. So I thought what we would do is start today by each of you taking a moment to share your sense as what you see as most novel about this election, but also, and importantly, what do you think is the most significant element of continuity from previous elections? Who'd like to jump in?
I'm happy to start if that's helpful.
Yes, please. Thank you, Mandy.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, unprecedented is definitely the catchphrase, right? I feel like I saw it all over social media. It was everywhere. It was in everything that we issued, right? And that's because, so just full disclosure, everything that I'm going to talk about is really only through the lens of Ohio. So I can't talk about what happened in Michigan. I defer to, my good friend and colleague, Jonathan, on that. But I'm only opining on what, we saw and what we experienced in the state of Ohio. So another disclaimer is I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. And so I'll disclaim everything that I'm saying. And that's my background is in the law. With that being said, there's, you know, really a legal principle in election law, Purcell, right? And it's this legal principle in Supreme Court case where, you know, you don't change things, you know, right before an election. You don't change the rules. You don't change the system. You just let the system play out, right? Like the rules are set, and we try to keep them that way. And that's how election officials are ingrained, right? As little change as possible. And then there was this little thing called COVID-19 that came and blew all of that up, right? So election officials in general, at least in Ohio, and I include myself in this description, are, you know, we don't want to see change. We want to know what the known knowns are. We want to know what the unknowns are, and we want to have control over everything, right? Because the system, this process, it's our baby, right? It's what we put all of this work and everything into is a successful administration of an election. Again, COVID-19 turned that 100% upside down. You know, a lot of laws, a lot of rules, a lot of everything were not built under a principle of a global pandemic. And so you're virtualizing everything. You're immediately shifting to vote by mail. You're changing, you know, so much of the process while trying to keep it whole and trying to keep it the same and keep the integrity there. And I know, you know, that we were successful in doing that, but the challenge in and of itself was adjusting to all of the adversity that a global pandemic presented. In Ohio, you know, our crisis and our adversity started in March. Our primary was set to take place on March 17th. And that was right in the heat of the COVID outbreak and really it taking hold in the United States. So, you know, we were in an absolute crisis in Ohio, and again, still an unprecedented situation where our health director ordered that the polls do not open, you know, just mere hours before they were set to open. So to say that that was a crisis, you know, is an understatement. But what we learned through that process and through that experience was, you know, our election officials need PPE. If we're going to hold in-person voting, which of course our laws require in the state of Ohio in November, we had to immediately get on top of all of the changes that needed to happen, the social distancing, setting up the polling locations, making sure that we were virtualizing anything and everything that could be virtualized, making sure that we were keeping not only election officials safe, but voters safe. You know, how do you apply all of the orders, the health orders and the governor's orders that are going on into a, you know, constitutionally protected right of voting? How does all of that interplay legally and administratively? And so the challenges that we saw just with the pandemic were mass. But, you know, one of the first things we did in Ohio was we, after the primary was concluded at the end of April, and really moved to an all vote by mail primary conclusion, was to gather experts all over the nation, all over the state, and hold every single week, essentially a ready for November task force meeting that was open to the public that the Secretary of State chaired. And we brought in, and it included local election officials, because we have 88 county boards of elections in Ohio who are run by 4 appointed bipartisan, so 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. They are the ones who are administering the election. So much like what Jonathan said, Ohio is bottom up and very decentralized, which is very rare as far as elections goes. And as a state administrator, give a lot of challenges because we can't control a ton. But we held these ready for November task force, and they were so effective. We were able to parse through major policy issues and major discussions related to the pandemic, USPS, anything that was facing the election as a challenge. And we were able to have those discussions publicly. So voters could listen in. They could hear about what we were doing in Ohio to make sure that our election was going to be safe, secure, accurate, and fair. Another really big thing that we did was we issued a CARES directive in Ohio, requiring the boards of elections to spend. We gave 90% of our CARES dollars that were granted to us from the federal government directly to the boards of elections to prepare for an election in the pandemic. And those were all prioritized. So increased absentee ballots, a paper backup poll book at each and every precinct, in addition to the e-poll books, making sure that there was PPE, anything and everything that we thought was going to be necessary for November, we put in that CARES directive. So the amount of work that we did, and I'm only mentioning the pandemic. I'm not mentioning, foreign influence. I'm not mentioning the climate that we were under and in. All of those challenges added up to what we say as unprecedented. The amount of change that election officials experienced in Ohio and nationwide, right before one of the most consequential elections of our time, was mass, and to my knowledge, not ever experienced before. So, we rose to the challenge. Our boards did a phenomenal job of implementing everything that we required of them, and they got the job done. And I guess just on the positive end, before I pass it on to Jonathan, is, the numbers that we saw in Ohio, the statistics were also unprecedented. We had 74% voter turnout in a global pandemic. That is absolutely record breaking. We had a 94% return rate of absentee ballots, also record breaking. We had 8 counties with over 80% voter turnout. And we had 58.6% of all ballots cast were cast early, which is just phenomenal. I mean, my MIT friend is going through the data. That's what we're doing too. We want to understand how unprecedented this election was from a data perspective too. And it's all really great things as it pertains to Ohio and the turnout that we saw. So hard work. As Secretary LaRose, a Green Beret, always says, we sweat, out of battle so we don't bleed in war. And that is really what we did in the state of Ohio. So, proud of everything that occurred. It wasn't easy, but it was certainly worth it because, as I've mentioned, previously in our prep session, our democratic process, right? It's not perfect. Elections aren't perfect. They weren't designed to be perfect, but they work. And our system that we have in this, great country was put under a stress test that has never been experienced before. And we overcame that stress test, right? The results of the election are accurate and they're correct. And it was a secure, safe, accessible, and fair election. And all Americans should be proud of that.
No doubt, thanks to your phenomenal efforts and the team that you described throughout the state. Jonathan, I'm wondering, did it look the same in Michigan? What did you see as unprecedented? What did you see as continuities?
So much of what Mandy said for Ohio is true for Michigan as well. I mean, the biggest change, obviously, no surprise, for our elections was the pandemic. That upended everything we do in elections in Michigan and all around the country, and we had to adjust a lot of our procedures at the state, county, and local level to continue to be able to hold our elections under those circumstances. I think that we had many ways of adapting to it that were similar to what Ohio did, but reflect some of the differences in our system, which is even more local and more decentralized than Ohio. I think beyond the direct effect of the pandemic on the election, which I'm not going to really go into because it basically would just be repeating what Mandy said. I think one thing that really has changed, we certainly saw this in Michigan. I think Michigan was a microcosm of the entire country in this regard, is the way that the experience of elections, both for election administrators and for voters and the public and the media and everyone else who consumes elections, has really shifted away from the concept of one election day. we in Michigan were already expecting to see more people voting early, more people voting by mail because of changes to our state constitution that were made by ballot initiative in 2018, which gave voters the ability to register up through election day, which gave them the ability to vote absentee without giving a reason. So we were already sort of moving towards a system where we could expect more votes to be cast before election day. And then also in our state, an extended period of time after election day that would be needed to count those ballots. In our state, clerks aren't allowed to start counting those ballots until election day itself, which is why in Michigan and some other states, you saw the counting going well into Wednesday, whereas in Ohio and other states that allow some early processing, they were able to finish earlier. But in Michigan and all around the country, we really saw both a shift to more voting and more voter activity before election day, and then also a greater amount of election administration work following election day. So that changed a lot of behaviors. It was very difficult for election administrators because they had sort of almost like an extended election season, which had elements of election day that sort of stretched both before and after November 3rd. But it also changed it changed the behavior of political campaigns. It changed the behavior of civic groups because the way they do get out the vote efforts changed. I think it changed political advertising. I think you saw more of an emphasis on doing that farther out before the election. That's not really my field, but that's just my observation. So that whole period leading up to November 3rd was really a period of voting. That's not entirely new, but we saw it to a much greater extent this year than in years prior. And then also, just because of the nature of the need to count so many of these absentee ballots in some states, starting on election day, we did see that period of waiting for results extend past November 3rd. And we fully expected that to happen. We knew that was going to happen. So that really has, I think, changed just the way elections, that people experience elections, and also the way that elections appear to people. And I don't think that's going to go back. I don't think it's ever going to go back to the way it was. This was not caused entirely by the pandemic. I think it's caused partially by changes to voting procedures in Michigan and other states. I think we're all have to just sort of get used to this idea that the election is more of a period than a single day. In terms of what I think is constant, the reason that our election was able to be successful, the number one reason, was because we have the same constant set of strong, civic-minded, nonpartisan workers and volunteers that run our elections. We have, every state has a different system, but we have, appointed or elected clerks who are either nonpartisan or do have a partisan affiliation, but are committed to doing their job in a nonpartisan way. We have poll workers who are willing to rise to the challenge and go work before election day or on election day, even during a pandemic, who, more than ever before this year, showed that their commitment to democracy and their commitment to making sure that people's right to vote is honored. But that's really a commitment that we've seen in past elections as well. That's the same spirit we've seen before. And we also have a really robust system of checks and balances that ensure that the election results can be trusted. We have, again, this varies state to state, but we always have, rules about bipartisan election workers. We have in Michigan bipartisan boards of county canvassers, and then a bipartisan board of state canvassers. So that whole system that relies on a core of patriotic, civic-minded workers really was the number one reason we were able to be successful this election, as we were in elections prior, and that is something that will continue. So I think that's something that is constant and will continue to be.
Thanks, Jonathan. I want to turn next to Rob. We've heard now from two senior election officials about their experiences and the changes in political culture and voter behavior and all of these things. How does it look from your vantage point regarding the precedented or continuous nature of our election?
Sure. Yeah. So I come at this question from a very different perspective from Amanda and Jonathan, and that I'm not involved in the nuts and bolts of running an election, so I'm quite far removed. And I'll say that from that perspective, in some respects, this election was one of the most normal things about 2020 in a truly unusual year. A lot of the dynamics of the election, I think, were quite usual. So Americans are extremely polarized along party lines, and they vote overwhelmingly along party lines. Republicans overwhelmingly vote for Republicans. Democrats overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. And a pandemic didn't change that. You know, an economic crash didn't change that. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't change that. This is the way Americans typically vote today, and that's the way it's been, at least in the last few cycles. The electoral map doesn't appear to have changed all that much, at least not in a way that would suggest, a dramatic geographical realignment. Mail-in ballots were rejected at similar or lower rates than in previous elections. There was a lot of fear of sort of endless lines at polling places, and those fears mostly didn't materialize. A lot of fear of fraud, those fears mostly didn't materialize. Fears of violence and intimidation at the polls, those again mostly didn't materialize. So in all of those respects, I think the election was pretty normal. There were some aspects that were new and surprising. I mean, obviously the pandemic, the turn to mail-in voting, the really high levels of voter turnout despite all of those challenges. Those are things that Amanda and Jonathan already spoke about at length, but I'll just reinforce that. Maybe just to highlight a couple things that surprised me, and there are a lot, so I'll just highlight a couple. One, I was surprised by Trump's inroads with Black and Latinx voters. And I actually think that's really a good thing. I spend most of my time doing research outside of the US in contexts where political parties tend to organize along ethnic or sectarian lines. And I have worried about a similar phenomenon in the US, especially in the wake of Trump's 2016 victory, which was in no small part a function of rural, non-college educated white voters. And Trump seemed to be very intentionally appealing to that demographic, and I worried that that might further a trend in which the Republican Party becomes increasingly homogeneous and white, and the Democrats become increasingly sort of the party of everybody else. And I think that if that trend were to continue, I think that would be really problematic. Yet in 2020, Trump performed surprisingly well with Black and Latinx voters, and I think that's a really a good thing. It's not a good thing for the Democratic Party, but I think it is a good thing for American democracy. I think it's a good thing for, I think if the Republican Party saw itself as sort of a genuinely multiracial coalition, I think that would be, I think that would improve the quality of our democracy. I don't want to get too partisan, but I will say maybe I wasn't surprised, but I was certainly shocked is probably not too strong a word, and dismayed by the president's behavior in the wake of the election. That has certainly been abnormal and quite important. And I don't think we should comfort ourselves with the notion that the winner of the election is almost certainly going to be sworn in on January 20th. I think we have seen how dangerous it can be when you combine one, hyperpartisanship, with two, a very strong executive, and three, a very decentralized electoral system. And even though that system appears to have worked, and it seems like it's going to deliver the presidency to the victor of the election, I worry that if the executive wants to try to manipulate that system, there are lots of ways for him to do it, precisely because it is so decentralized. And it's easy to imagine that this election would be quite a bit messier than it already is had it been closer in a handful of key states, or if there had been a slightly different cast of characters at the state and local levels, or if there had been a slightly different slate of judges on the federal bench in some of these key states. You can imagine this really going off the rails. I think obviously all of the talk about fraud, which I think is really quite unwarranted. It is undermining faith in the American electoral process among voters who are already skeptical of it, and further polarizing an already extremely polarized electorate. So that is new, and that is quite worrisome.
Thank you for your insights, Rob. And now, lastly, John Curiel, your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a bit at the intersection of all the panelists here. So what I can say is that the experiences seen in Ohio and Michigan are mainly generalizable across the rest of the US. The biggest surprise or unprecedented aspect of 2020 for me is how well election administrators did. I mean, in general, state and local bureaucracies are not encouraged to innovate because in the event that anything goes wrong, people get fired and get lawsuits. But despite that, they faced an unprecedented pandemic and were able to actually handle it. Traditional issues that are usually plague election administration, such as how do you deal with a long queue of voters, now became even more paramount to address because if they didn't address queues, for example, you might have a huge outbreak in COVID. And despite all of these problems, but also especially given the fact that there was an extreme shortage of resources, they were able to innovate in ways, rely upon civic-minded citizens, dip into savings, adopt research from various levels, from universities, national government, so on and so forth, to actually hold an election that, for the most part, went without a hitch. From the perspective of election sciences, a problematic election would be one something like Florida 2000, where there were poor ballot design choices, for example, that then led to an actual changing of the election outcome, confused voters, all that. Insofar as there was really anything wrong with the way 2020 was handled, maybe with how some of the early lines were handled for like early voting, but really that's a problem that's faced every year. And upon basically getting a better field situation, it was immediately addressed and for the most part successful. And to remind you, the issue of how to handle early voting and voting lines is what's called an NP hard problem, in that there's an infinite number of possible solutions, therefore it's not actually solvable. Yet despite that, in the face of pandemic, election administrators were able to solve this. So overall, election administrators held this country together. That then brings about the second point, is that they were able to hold this country together despite the complete failure of our national elected political parties. While they were doing all of this, there was an attempt both through inaction and not passing the resources necessary to actually fund local election administrators across the country to actually deal with this pandemic, and then also an attempt by party leaders to actually then delegitimize this election in every aspect of the voting process. It's now gotten to the point where, for the Republican Party at least, about 2/3 of Republicans do not believe that the election was fair and that there was some presence of fraud, despite the fact that there is literally no evidence of this. And basically what this goes to show you is that this was indeed a stress test, one that election administrators performed admirably through. What is worrisome is that if this stress test continues, at a certain point, the body politic breaks down. And just seeing this pivot of responsibility, where usually people, tend to like their politicians, but, dislike their bureaucratic officials, it's complete reverse of that. The true heroes of this election were election administrators. You should thank Amanda and Jonathan for their valiant efforts. I mean, we're talking about people who literally put their lives on the line. They had a chance of getting COVID, and having survived through it myself, it can really ruin you. So yeah, that's definitely what's surprising about me to this election, and concerning going into the future from more of a elected official party perspective.
Thanks, John. And you commented so nicely about the work of Manny and Jonathan, and I want to turn to them next to think about how Americans understand this process of electoral post-election vote certification. My sense is that prior to 2020, most people, to the extent that they thought about it or understood it at all, thought of it as a fairly straightforward process of procedural tabulation and reporting. Is that, from your vantage point, an accurate assessment, or do you see that there are, maybe have always been, elements of subjectivity in that process? And if there are subjective decisions that have to be made or judgment calls, how do you and your team handle those?
So I think, generally speaking, there is a profound misunderstanding of the entire system. People often who are opining on the system have never even been a poll worker. So for me, it's really hard to level with people if you haven't actually worked an election or understand, right? And so we have a lot of people on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook pontificating on something that is so complicated and oversimplifying it into 150 characters when it can't be, right? I mean, it's incredibly complicated. And to add on to the level of complication, to Jonathan's earlier point, every single state is different. So really, when you try to overgeneralize something, which is another theme of our country's psyche right now, I'm just going to overgeneralize everything. You end up missing the mark and missing the mark very significantly. And that often leads to a ton of dis and misinformation, which is what we saw systemically in this election, right? And people are so quick to get that tweet out and so quick to send that post that they don't even check if it's true, right? They don't even check, or they don't care. So, that's just my 2 cents on sort of where we are as a country as it pertains to opining on elections, right? I view it, and I know Jonathan does too, as a science, right? It's legal, but it's also a science, right? There's so much technology, there's procedures, there's protocols, and it's very complex. And so you have the election night reporting process, which again has been largely misunderstood. And that's what I would still refer to as separate from the post-election activity period. You have election night reporting, which of course is always unofficial. And Secretary LaRose, in his infinite wisdom and thinking ahead of the curve, he actually changed our election night reporting website because we knew that more people than ever were going to be voting by mail. We knew that. We knew that there were going to be this sum of ballots that were outstanding, right? That would not be reported on election night because in Ohio, as long as absentee ballots are postmarked by November 2nd, like the day before, in this case, it was November 2nd, they have 10 days to get back to the board. So we have, trailing absentees. We've had trailing absentees. This is not new to the process. But we knew that there were going to be so many that could alter outcomes, right? That you saw on election night. And this is inevitably what we saw in Pennsylvania and what we saw in Georgia. And this is why Secretary LaRose was so passionate ahead of time of getting that front and center on our election night reporting system to say, no. If there's a margin of error and there's these outstanding absentee ballots and there's these outstanding provisional ballots, because provisional ballots cannot be voted on by the boards of elections until the 11th day, starting the 11th day, because again, you still have those absentee ballots to come in. So my point being is we did not want anyone outside of Ohio or inside of Ohio to say, you know what, this race is won by so-and-so, when it's not statistically possible to say that, right? And so that was front and center on our election night reporting website. You knew if you truly were interested, or even if you were not, the first thing you saw was how many outstanding absentee ballots and provisional ballots there were left. So election night reporting results are always unofficial, always. They've never been official. They've always been unofficial. And so beating that drum publicly was so critical to combating a lot of mis and disinformation out there, and making sure that voters in Ohio understood that they could wake up the next day and the result could change, right? Or not, by the end of the official canvass process. So the official canvass process, meaning the post-election activity, is really getting all of those absentee ballots, voting on the provisionals, conducting any recounts, conducting a post-election audit, which is required in every county in Ohio, and then certifying the results of the election. And so what Secretary LaRose did from a public communications perspective is we actually, we went walk on, social media. We put up slides that said, this is what's happening in the process now. This is what's about to happen in the process now. This is what's coming, so that there were no questions from the public as to what was going on with the election in the state of Ohio. And we feel like that radical transparency to the voters was really helpful because it helped people not question what we were doing and explain it.
Sounds like, yeah, I was going to say it sounds to me like Twitter notwithstanding, that there was really a tremendous amount of educational work that needed to be done, and yet that was probably one more new responsibility for your office in 2020 than, or at least maybe not a new one, but an expanded one in 2020. Jonathan,
Absolutely.
is that how you saw it in your area, Jonathan?
I think there's a lot of similarities. I mean, I agree with Mandy that these procedures that we use to run our elections are objective. They're codified. They obviously everything requires human beings, and human beings can make mistakes, but it's not a subjective process. I think that the sort of the idea that you're going to be able to educate everyone in the public about all the nuances of how elections work is a losing effort. I would love for all Americans to understand all the nuances of how all the election procedures work, but I think the focus does need to really be on the big picture and sort of helping people understand, what they're looking at and why, and big picture, what does this mean? We also spent a huge amount of time preparing the public for the idea that these results that you see coming out on election night are unofficial. And I think that is something that largely got through to the to the media, to legislators, to people who understand the way the process works. But when you're talking about people who are coming to the process more casually, and maybe getting their information indirectly, it is, if you're just coming to it for the first time and you're bombarded by all these numbers coming at you, it's probably not realistic that you're going to completely appreciate the fact that the numbers that are coming in on election night, they may have mistakes in them. There may have been human error in transmitting those unofficial results, or there may be something that's going to get corrected during a canvass process that takes a number of weeks. So we did lay a lot of groundwork ahead of time in trying to make sure the public and opinion leaders and places where people get their information were aware of how that process worked. And this was really something that I think was definitely a nationwide effort. Like Ohio, Michigan we convened a security advisory commission that had participants from within Michigan, outside of Michigan. We spent a lot of time in that group talking about how to combat misinformation and disinformation. We set up sort of a rapid response effort on social media, on our website, to try to sort of combat a lot of the misconceptions that were being spread around. And we also benefited both from learning from Ohio and what a bunch of other states were also doing, but also having the support of federal partners like CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They helped organize us a lot. We did tabletop exercises where we simulated incidents and misinformation attacks. That really helped prepare us. It's not something that I think is ever going to be perfect, because, as I said, you're never going to completely explain to everyone how this stuff works. But it's a constant effort to try to make sure people understand the big picture of what's happening and why.
As I'm listening to you both talk, there's certainly so much to feel, as you describe it, confident in the systems that you're describing. And yet I want to go back to a comment that, Rob, you made in your last remark about cautioning us not to be too comfortable. It's a truism that voting is a cornerstone of the American democracy. When you look at your research on democratic erosion, either in the US or in elsewhere, what does this election tell us about the state of our democracy?
Well, I mean, this is, obviously with all due respect to Amanda and Jonathan and all of the election workers who did such a tremendous job. And I strongly second John's comment earlier that we should, we owe them an enormous debt of gratitude. I do think this election shows, reveals or at least reinforces some pretty worrisome trends. One, so I spoke about how polarized American voters are, and I think that's not a good thing for democracy for a variety of different reasons. First of all, there's an increasing body of evidence that polarization is what's really driving political participation today. So the more polarized voters are, the more likely they are to do things like turn out to vote or contribute to campaigns. It's not about pursuing particular issue positions either. It's about this feeling that we have towards the other party, where Democrats increasingly loathe and fear Republicans, and Republicans increasingly loathe and fear Democrats. There's also an increasing body of evidence that polarized voters are willing to privilege partisanship over experience or other indicators of merit when they choose who to vote for. Perhaps most problematic, that there's an increasing body of evidence that polarized voters are willing to tolerate politicians who flout democratic norms and institutions as long as they happen to share their partisan affiliation. none of that is good for democracy in the long term. And I think this election really reinforced just how polarized, how severely polarized we really are. Another thing, and I don't want to speak too long, but another thing that worries me is increasingly you see voters using the outcome of the election to infer the quality of the election process. And Donald Trump actually, explicitly told his voters to make that sort of inference when he told them that the only way that he could lose is through fraud. But certainly, Republicans and Trump voters are not the only ones who are susceptible to that sort of thinking. I think Democrats in 2016, many Democrats believed it simply couldn't be the case that Donald Trump won the election over Hillary Clinton unless the Russians were really the ones behind the scenes pulling the strings or something like that, right? So they use the outcome to then back out the quality of the process, and that's, for one thing, that's immensely disrespectful of the extraordinary work that people like Amanda and Jonathan are doing, but it's also quite dangerous. I think that's exactly the sort of dynamic you see in places where elections become incredibly hotly contested, and where the risk of violence becomes larger over time. So those are just a couple of observations there.
I want to shift the conversation to John. Rob, you just had mentioned, this discussion about, accusations of fraud and this discussion around counting legal votes and legal votes and illegal votes. And, I'm wondering, John, what you make of this language of legal and illegal votes as you look at this from your roles in election science.
Yes, that's a very good question. I do have a few slides prepped on the topic. So let's see if you can see this. So yeah, in general, when it comes to what Rob said, we never really want to use the outcome of the election as proof or disproof of fraud. If we were to use scientific method, there is a way that we can analyze the process in such a way that we can gauge the quality of how the election went, and if there was anything that went wrong, including fraud. And keep in mind that insofar as there is claim of illegal votes, we're not just talking about like somebody voting in place of their spouse for some different candidate. We're talking about fraud on a level not seen in the history of American politics, surpassing that of anything seen in the Gilded Age, affecting several battleground states of very high populations. So that's going to be a very large burden of evidence that's going to be need to be fulfilled. So insofar as we are to give any credence to those alleging that there were illegal votes, you'd expect then for their basically motivation and research questions to be motivated out of some actual odd outcome, one that's not explained, and that actually still is not explained after they look at the research that's been done by people like myself, Rob, all the election administrators, what's been going on in the news, all of that. From that, they develop some type of theory that can actually explain what happened. In this case, their theory is fraud. And then given how they expect fraud to have occurred, there must be testable hypotheses. So far, insofar as there's any claims of illegal votes, they are all falling on their faces at the very first two steps. And some of these, so there are many claims. Basically right now, those alleging fraud and illegal votes are just throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks, which is never a good sign. But I'll go briefly over a few of these. So first, the idea that Biden could not have won without fraud. So let's see. That would basically imply that basically Biden was trailing Trump and all of a sudden saw some huge jump on election day. That's actually not what we saw. Biden was always leading Trump in the polls, even though they were off, as we saw on election day. And also, if you were to expect to see odd election outcomes, what you'd expect then, given how the alleged fraud have occurred, mainly in urban areas, that there would be then huge spikes in support for Democratic candidates in urban areas, and that these results would not correlate what we saw in previous elections. What we actually see is a near perfect correlation from 2016. Insofar as it's different, there's basically a uniform intercept shift, because as it turns out, the suburbs were the main means that Biden actually won in 2020. Insofar as there's oddities in urban areas, it's actually because they were less Democratic than 2016. So that immediately just goes in the face of the supposed irregularities that are supposed to have occurred. Insofar as there's the idea of a slow count, and any slow count being proof of fraud, that's not an actual measure of fraud. The only way in which you can vaguely justify it being a good measure is if you're talking about a very, very incompetent authoritarian regime. Think Eastern Europe right before the fall of the Soviet Union. And also, we actually knew going into this election that the pandemic would cause a slow count. And also, insofar as we see basically shifts from what we saw on election night to what we saw officially, that occurred both for Democrats and Republicans and in battleground and non-battleground states. So that also doesn't really make sense. Additionally, insofar as we actually look as to what's the primary cause, it is basically entirely the combination of when states were allowed to count ballots and then also how many people voted by mail. If we look at one state, for example, that allowed the counting of ballots on or before election day, North Carolina, we saw by 5 hours, basically 100% of the results were in for both parties, and we knew the election outcome. Pennsylvania, which did not allow the tallying of votes, we saw then for both Democrats and Republicans, that took a very long time to actually start getting all the ballots counted. By hour 24, we still didn't know, still did not have all the ballots counted for both Republicans and Democrats. A bit more for Democrats because they were more susceptible to COVID-19 and therefore tend to vote more by mail. And then there's also this other analysis going around Twitter right now, the idea that there were oddities in some of the ballot returns, something called Benford's Law. For some background, basically Benford's Law is used in financial forensics, where you basically say, if you see too many numbers of a certain digit, that implies fraud, mainly being like, let's say anything taxed above $1,000, well, anything above $1,000 is taxed, and you see a bunch of returns for $999.99, that would be a bit suspicious. And they say, oh, apply to election results, this reveals oddities. So there's several problems to all of these. First is that they're using often the wrong level of geography, counties instead of precincts. More importantly, though, by using the first digit of Benford's Law, all these analyses prove is that Democrats live in more populated areas, which, I mean, that's a well-known fact. I mean, like, Democrats tend to live in urban areas, and there has been geographic sorting over a number of decades now. If you actually use the second digit, which is how we use it in election sciences, all that really does is that it's a first cut, basically showing that there might be something odd going here, and these oddities could be due to other reasons besides fraud. It's never actually proof, and also insofar as it's used, it's only really effective when you're studying authoritarian regimes, where it's actually possible to basically fudge the election tally results that you release to the public. And also, insofar as this method is actually used and has been invented by a man named Walter Mavane, his analysis on the 2020 election is that he actually found no evidence of fraud. And there are more claims which I can refute, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. But basically, this is just, going through some of the core arguments about there being illegal votes and fraud. There is no credibility to any of them. They're lying with statistics, are just not paying attention to anything done on the field of research and election sciences. Their conclusion is based upon their dissatisfaction with the election outcome. And I am always happy to look into new measures of how to detect fraud, claims, and all of that. But what we're seeing right now is not proof of legal voting, simply people upset with the election outcome.
John, thank you. And at this point, I want to make sure that we have time for our student questions. So at this point, if a student would like to raise a question, would you please use the raise hand feature? It's a blue button in the participants sidebar. If you click on the raise hand button, and then when I call on you, then you can turn your video on and your audio on. And at that point, please just let us know if the question is for a particular panelist or for the panel as a whole, and then panelists jump in. Let's see if there's any questions from the audience at this point. Oh, we've got a question from Miller Kelsey. Miller, would you turn on your audio and video and ask a question?
Hi. First off, I want to say thank you to all the panelists that are taking their time out of their day to speak with us. It means a lot to everyone here at Johnson & Wales and this amazing event. But I have a question for John Curiel. What Democratic voters, or what group would you say grew in importance in vitally determining the election in 2020? And which group would you say is going to possibly vastly affect future ones? I've been seeing and reading that it is the middle class. What are your opinions on this?
So it's going to vary a lot by state. I mean, that's always the go-to answer, probably not the one you're looking for. Specifically, so if we're talking about like the West, for example, like Arizona, what was pivotal in that state, for example, was the presence of the Navajo Nation voting, as they were instrumental in actually like achieving that margin. So that's going to be the one base of Democratic support. Insofar as this election was different from 2016, the suburbs were what also ultimately allowed Biden to win the election. And of these suburban voters, many are middle class, though there is, of course, going to be some variation depending on what city you're talking about, based on whether or not they're like traditional suburban or, they're increasingly Hispanic suburban. Hispanics are definitely going to be one major source of contention between the parties. As we saw, there was an increase in Hispanic support for the GOP. Insofar as the analyses so far I've looked at reveal that there has been an increase in the Hispanic support for the GOP, these have been primarily from non-metro areas. So really, insofar as we're talking about non-white demographics, it's really going to be Hispanics and or those living within the suburbs, basically of all races. I should note one other thing about Hispanics is that it's a very broad term. Like, I mean, there are some Hispanics where, skin tone, you can probably judge that they are Hispanic. For example, I myself am of Mexican descent. I'm fairly pale. And also, like, we're talking about like Miami-Dade, Florida. Cuban Hispanics are going to be very different from Mexican Hispanics. They're going to be, for example, very anti-communist because of their experience in Cuba, and therefore a lot more receptive to, like anti-socialist claims. But yeah, if there's one thing that I've learned from this election, it's that be very careful about your broad generalizations. It's possible to narrow the scope, but from there, knowing the local conditions is going to be of the utmost importance.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Miller. Are there other questions from the audience? And again, if you click on the participant button and use the blue raise hand feature, I'll be happy to call on you. While I'm waiting for other folks to raise their hands, I do have another question for the group. I recognize this is a bit dangerous territory, but I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind trying to predict the future. So we began this discussion talking about the unprecedented nature of the 2020 election, COVID, mail-in balloting, unprecedented turnout, newly anointed swing states, legal challenges. How do you think elections will look different in the years to come? And what's one change to the system that you think would improve the American electoral process? And while our panelists are answering, I do encourage our student audience members to consider their questions and use their blue raise hand feature. Thank you.
I'm happy to take a crack at it. This is Jonathan. I think that I think we are going to see some acceleration of states taking on some procedures that have worked well from each other. It's going to be a bit of an uneven process because of differences in political preferences, difference in the rate of legislation, and who can change what and how from state to state. But I do think that the increase in number of people that are voting before election day, whether it be in a sort of an in-person early voting or voting by mail, is probably going to stick around. What you generally see is that when people start voting by mail or they start voting before election day, they tend to like that. And so, in Michigan, we already were kind of there in terms of our laws changing, but a lot of other states who may have had, varying levels of allowing people to vote early with or without an excuse, they basically all changed that in one way or another because of the pandemic and allowed people more options to vote remotely. I think it's fair to expect that at least in a lot of places that some version of that will become more permanent. So I think that it's not going to look the same everywhere, but I think that you're going to see more people continuing to vote by mail and vote early. I think that's here to stay to some extent. I do think that a change to the system, I'm not exactly sure how it would it's not something that you could do at a national level. This would require state-by-state action. But I do think that to the extent we could have a little bit more standardization in how ballots are reported and counted on election night, it would be helpful. I don't know how likely that is to happen, but when you see some states like Michigan that go past election day finishing their counts, some states like Pennsylvania, it took them a couple days longer than us. And then you have different kinds of ballots that are being counted for different kinds of reasons. Like in Arizona, it was like the opposite of Michigan, where they had all their mail ballots that they were able to count, but the in-person ballots were taking longer. That does create, I think, a lot of confusion across, in terms of the way the public consumes these election results. It would be, if possible, it would be nice to see us move in a direction where states are able to have a little bit more consistency in the way that results are reported and the timing of that. But that's something that would be really dependent on state-by-state action.
Thanks, John. And it looks like we have a question from our co-host, Tyler. Tyler Pekarsky, would you turn on your camera and ask your question? Thank you.
Absolutely. So this one is directed at Jonathan Brader and Amanda Grandjean. And I know Dr. Curiel kind of answered this a little bit, but I was wondering specifically in your two states, have you seen any instances of legitimate voter fraud?
I mean, I can go ahead and disclaim that, we, any instance of, well, really, what does voter fraud mean, right? And so I think we got to understand what legally we're talking about. Is it double voting? Is it voting and not being registered? Is it a holistic word that describes every piece of illegal voting activity? So I think it's important to understand what we're actually talking about when we use the word voter fraud, because I think both the word voter fraud and the word voter suppression are in reality not common at all, but are overly used to incite concerns about our democratic process. But so we just certified the results. Our boards just went through the official canvass process and are in the process of post-election audits, and then we'll refer any even concern to their local law enforcement and their county prosecutor for investigation. So we'll get those reports. We're a member of ERIC, which is Ohio's a member of ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center that does research as it pertains to voting in two states. So we'll go through that process here in some time, but anything even concerning, we've reported to our state, local, and federal partners. But I can't say that there's been any prosecutions at this point in Ohio, at least.
Basically the same in Michigan. We haven't seen any evidence of illegal activity or irregularities occurring on any significant scale in this election. What we saw is what we see in every election, which is a small number of, issues involving human error for election workers. It happens from time to time. As in Ohio, when we do get an actual allegation of any kind of illegal activity involving elections that might be criminal, we refer that to law enforcement. There's been a handful of cases in Michigan, but nothing widespread whatsoever. It seems to be consistent with what we've seen in recent elections as well.
Thank you.
And it looks like we have a question from Cooper. Cooper, would you turn on your camera and ask your question? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Excuse me. I just had a question for, I think all of the panelists, I think we talk a lot about, these threats to our election process, whether it's misinformation, fraud, international infringement. But I was wondering, what do you all think are the greatest threats to both election security and the promise of American democracy?
I would just say informed voters inform voters, right? So I think, foreign influence and foreign interference is always going to be a concern. But I think the greater concern is just educating the public about how elections work, how they're secured, how their state systems operate, because it's just like, it's like the old saying about the First Amendment. The only way to drown out a lie is with the truth, right? And so consistently arming people with accurate information, and having democracy itself, right? Like the capital D, like democracy, be above politics, right? And rise above the political nature of the day, to uphold, what our country was founded on. And I think, the very basic way to do that is to arm voters with accurate and truthful information, and ensure that they're spreading that accurate and truthful information.
I think I agree with many of the information, disinformation, and education category is really both both the threat and the potential for improvement and promise. I mean, I mentioned the work we had done in Ohio, done various other states had done in preparing for potential election emergencies and threats. We prepared for all sorts of scenarios. We spent a lot of time preparing for and defending against cyber attacks that may have come from foreign or domestic sources. We prepared a lot for violent incidences or incidents of, voter violence or intimidation at polling places. We didn't really see a whole lot of either one of those materialize. I think that's partially because we were prepared for them. We didn't really spend a whole lot of time prior to March preparing for a global pandemic. It was one of the scenarios that we would sometimes run through, but not one that I don't think we really took that seriously. And that was much more of a sort of a slow motion disaster that we had to deal with. But the one that we spent a lot of time preparing for, and still came and we were able to respond to it, but still need to improve is this just broad category of misinformation, disinformation, and how it can affect public confidence. It's just so difficult. It is this sort of constant game of whack-a-mole of combating this. And so, over the long term, I think we've gotten through this election, but over the long term, there are, certainly concerns about the public's confidence in election, that it's a continuous process. Of bringing people in, of educating people how the system works, and just transparently and clearly explaining it as best we can. That's an ongoing opportunity for improvement, but there is absolutely a threat and a concern there as well.
Let's see. So I guess my conclusion would be the greatest threat is going to be the hyperpolarization we have in the country right now. I mean, even if we do try to educate voters and tell them like, hey, this is the actual truth versus, an obvious lie, if the people hearing that already think that, election administrators or academics are literal servants of Satan, they're probably going to discount everything we say. Like I myself, I'm publishing some previous research along with the director of MedSil. When we put out work, we oftentimes get harassed by those thinking that, we're some part of grand conspiracy. And they believe that because of signals they're getting from their political leaders, which means that while we can do what we can to, try to improve our election infrastructure, make sure that's of such a sound quality that it's beyond reproach, none of that really matters if the country itself as a body politic destroys itself. And it's now getting to that as the basis of any democratic government is going to be at the very least some level of toleration of your fellow citizens, and the idea that you have some compassion towards them. But if you now have the country polarized into two camps and you view the other side as actually evil, there's not much I or really anyone in this panel can do about that. This is going to require country level buildings type of solutions, entire rebuilding of the body politic. Rob probably has the most insight on that, so I will now end. But yeah, I didn't mean to be too much pessimistic, but I will. That's how I see it.
And I mean, I would just strongly second John's point. I think that the hyperpolarization is a major problem. I see that as the primary problem that we face as at least as a voting democracy. I think that things that are not major threats are fraud, irregularities. I think just as an aside, I think one thing and this is picking up on a point that Jonathan made, but you know, we tend not to be very good at distinguishing between fraud and irregularities, and there really isn't an important distinction between them. You know, and fraud is obviously much more problematic. Now, both of these things happen. So I think that those who argue that there was no fraud, and you do hear that argument made, I mean, that's simply not true. There is always some fraud, that is inevitable, and like there will always be some irregularities. The question is, you know, were they widespread, and more importantly, were they so pervasive as to potentially affect the outcome of the election? And at least in 2020 and in probably every prior election that we've held, the answer is an emphatic no. That said, I think that it's the claims of fraud echoed within a hyper polarized citizenry that is the much greater threat. It's our own deteriorating confidence in our electoral process. Maybe just to say one more thing that I think, and this is also picking up on a point that Jonathan made, but it does seem to me that to the extent that there are going to be threats to the electoral process, like the way we actually vote, some of those could be mitigated with a more nationalized process. And typically the argument that you hear for decentralization is that it makes it harder to manipulate the election in a sort of coordinated way, right? So Russia is going to be less able to affect the outcome of the election because it's administered in 50 states independently, and so Russia would have to coordinate that manipulation across those 50 states. But this, I think, that in a sense that's true, but it's also misleading because we have an electoral college, and so really the manipulation doesn't need to be coordinated at the national level. It simply needs to target a handful of key states, and the manipulation certainly doesn't have to come from outside of the United States, right? And even within the handful of key states, probably even just a handful of key precincts, right? Like it's not going to do much good to manipulate the vote in a place like Rhode Island, where I live, because you would have to, the manipulation would have to be massive for you to change the fact that this is a very blue-leaning state, right? And most states do lean pretty heavily one way or the other. So that the sort of the manipulation could be much more targeted, and I do think that is a potential worry. I'm less worried about external manipulation than I am about manipulation internally for the reasons that I discussed earlier. And I think it's worth noting that countries around the world have centralized election systems that work perfectly well and that are not subject to massive amounts of manipulation or fraud. So that strikes me as one thing we could do to try to prevent threats to our elections moving forward.
Well, at this point, thank you, Cooper, for your question. And I'd also like to conclude by thanking all of our students for their questions, and of course, our special guests, Mandy Grangine, Rob Blair, Jonathan Brader, and John Curiel, for this stimulating conversation and for sharing their experiences and their reflections on election 2020. I believe we have a slide here that we can show providing some further resources, additional resources in elections, democracy, and American politics, should you wish to explore additional material after the election. After the event is concluded, though perhaps after the election as well. And I will now hand the gavel back to Tyler, who can conclude our event. Again, my great thanks to all our participants and our students with questions. Thank you, everybody. Tyler?
Thank you everyone for participating in this event. We encourage you to keep an eye out for our future events presented by the Johnson & Wales Political Science Policy Lab to take place sometime in the near future, maybe 2021. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.